You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
Earlier this month, I was proud to host Saving Elephant's very first conservative cage match, where we pit together two titans of conservatism, or perhaps two conservative ideas, and invite on panelists to represent each viewpoint and debate each other. The first round took place on YouTube in a live stream, in a matchup between Edmund Burke and Leo Strauss. Now, since you may have missed it, since it was a YouTube live stream, I wanted to repurpose it here as a Saving Elephants podcast episode. And I will give no further introduction because I take care of all of that at the beginning of the live stream. So without further ado, here is the Burke versus Strauss cage match.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants show.
Hey guys, welcome to the very first of hopefully many conservative cage matches where we pick titans of the conservative intellectual tradition, either the individuals themselves or some of their ideas, and pit them against one another to do battle, to see who emerges the victor, or at least who makes some points that make you scratch your head, put a rock in your shoe, give you something worth thinking about. I really think one of the great strengths of the right is its ability to have these sort of internal debates in good faith with each other. Sometimes they can get kind of vicious, but honestly, sometimes this is the place where friendships and camaraderie is formed, and trying to understand what is the delicate balancing nature between things like virtue and liberty. We are starting off with a bang. Edmund Burke and Leo Strauss, two individuals that have many accolades and disciples, but you probably don't want to hear from me too much. I'm going to introduce to you our panelists for the evening. I have coming up first on the stage, Steve Hayward. Steve is no stranger to Saving Elephants, was on a recent episode where he helped me understand why I should be a little less critical. Oh, can you hear me? Let me pull that down. This is the problem with a live recording. Bear with me just a second, guys. How about Greg? Greg, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
You can, okay. We will try to get that fixed here in just a minute. Greg was on I'll start with the introduction on this end. Greg Collins, thank you for being here. I met you actually at a course you were given on Edmund Burke, and specifically his book, Reflections on the Revolution of France. Greg, of course, is a professor at Yale University, will be representing the Burke side of this conversation. Good to have you, Greg.
Hey, thank you.
Let me try with Lucretia. Lucretia, can you hear us?
I can now.
Okay.
Whatever you did worked for me.
Okay. Yeah, we might have to have Steve leave and come back. And we'll deal with that here just momentarily. But
I can send him a text and have him do that if you
don't mind. That would be helpful. And as you're doing that, I'm going to pull up Lauren Hall. This is part of the beauty of live stream, of course, is these things can go wrong in real time. But Lauren, we'll just soldier on. I was on your podcast. We made this political. There we go, with you and your co-host Laura Forkham, and of course you have both been on my podcast. Excellent show. You are a Burke scholar and writer of the blog, The Radical Moderate Guides to Life. Have I got that right?
Yeah.
Great to have you. Lucretia, of course, is on the screen. Lucretia is Steve's better half of the Three Whiskeys Happy Hour podcast. Better third, right. I know poor John's left out of this discussion, but...
I'm very upset about it because he says he doesn't like Burke or Strauss. So there you go.
Maybe you should have moderated, yeah.
That's what he said.
Steve, can you hear us now? Well, now we can't hear you.
The funny thing is Steve has the most sophisticated equipment of anyone I know doing a podcast.
How about now? Is this working?
It is working now.
Okay.
It is good to have you.
I'm not going to touch anything. Okay.
Great. I was just doing the introductions. Steve Hayward, of course, formerly of Berkeley, conservative in hiding, incognito in a sense, and currently of Pepperdine, was a recent guest on the show and helped try to cool some of my disagreements with the Trump administration, trying to explain to me why I shouldn't be quite so harsh on them. And Lucretia and Stephen Hayward, of course, represent the Leo Strauss version of this argument. Now, for those who are like, look, I don't know who Burke and Strauss is, I have no idea, I'm going to give an extremely An extremely brief kind of summary here over the basic argument. If you have no idea, I guarantee this conversation is going to be over your head probably from the beginning, but just in way of sort of an introduction, hopefully it'll wet your whistle and think, you know what, this sounds kind of interesting. I want to read more about these guys. Leo Strauss wrote in his magnus opum, Natural Right and History. He didn't write a lot about Burke, but toward the very end of the book, he writes about Edmund Burke and essentially summarizes some of his critiques as such, that he believed Burke's critique of abstract natural rights and his defense of things like tradition, prescription, and historically evolved institutions, that it ultimately abandoned the classical understanding of natural right grounded in reason that Strauss was arguing for. Burke was right. He wasn't completely critical of Burke. Burke was right, Strauss thinks, to criticize the abstract rationalist natural right doctrine of the Enlightenment era that led especially to things like the French Revolution and some of its excesses. But he went too far. In rejecting those modern doctrines, he failed to recover the classical natural right that we would find in Plato and Aristotle, and instead replaced it, maybe inadvertently, maybe unintentionally, with historicism. Of course, the great bugaboo of the Straussian tradition, the idea that our political standards are rooted in inherited tradition rather than accessible to us through reason. So Strauss's larger concern is philosophical. He sees Burke as part of a shift from the natural to the historical as a source of political authority. This has created a great rift among many conservative intellectual traditions in the United States. There are some who say, look, Edmund Burke is the central conservative figure and is right up there with the American founding fathers, whereas others say, nope, he was the guy that opened the door to historicism, essentially, and led to all sorts of excesses on the left. So with that, and please, panelists, if I have misidentified either of those two positions, feel free to correct the record. One last thing before we get started, those watching in real time, if you have an appropriate comment, I will be happy to share it. So for example, this would not be an appropriate comment. 10 of 10 best gay streamer award goes to Saving Elephants. Congratulations. But something that's a little bit more apropos to the conversation, we will try to share those. That being said, I'm going to lead it off for each individual to give a short, brief introduction to kind of your opening statements. We're going to start with Steve Hayward. I'm going to try to shift the screen here so that he shows up prominently. Let's see if I can accomplish this. Bear with me just a second. There we go.
There we go.
All right.
We're going to, Josh, we need to get you an actual producer who can do all that stuff for you so you don't have to. Burke would approve of that, right? It would be an inheritance, right? Well, let's see. Let's just say a few things to open up because there's so much to be said here. One is I'd add to what you say about Strauss's famous book, Natural Right and History. This is the last chapter of the book, and it's kind of odd that he ended with Burke and not other people you might think of like Kant or even Hegel or so forth. Second, I think it's quite relevant to today. We're having this big argument on the right, really, between what are now called the post-liberals, who dislike Enlightenment liberalism, dislike John Locke, dislike the Declaration of Independence, which, of course, Burke kind of did too, although he was coy about that. And the big point is America to be understood as a creedal nation based on its principles of the Declaration, or are we a historical nation like the British Constitution? And Burke is going to come back into the chat on that, and already is in a lot of ways. Second, I think to go beyond Burke, Strauss's Burke for just a moment, I think that the case against Burke can be stated by something that Strauss doesn't mention, and that is Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson loved two people above all. He loved Hegel and he loved Burke. And, that's when heads ought to start to explode, right? Because, Woodrow Wilson is sort of, the worst person ever in American history. Maybe that's a slight exaggeration. But how did he do that? Well, what he liked were the parts of Burke that Strauss picks on, of the many things he picks on, who thought constitutions evolve. Burke didn't use that term. That term was not used in the 18th century in the way we think of it today. But that idea, I think, is implicated in Burke's work, and Strauss picks on that a lot. Second, you already suggested a key note of this whole argument, Josh, in saying that Burke was critical of especially modern natural right, of people like Hobbes and Locke and so forth, and social contract theory. And that's because at the end of the day, he is skeptical of metaphysics. He doesn't deny metaphysics like a modern positivist or nihilist would, but he thinks it is, to say he thinks it has limited utility for practical politics would be an understatement. He's against metaphysical appeal. He's against abstractions. And so he doesn't like Locke. And he is reputed to have said, although this is a secondhand recollection of someone who heard him say this in Parliament, that John Locke's Second Treatise of Government was the worst book ever written, which is pretty strong. But as I say, I'd find some contemporary echoes of critics of the American regime today. So he's against speculative reason, as he calls it. I could go on, but I think I will draw to a close here. There's 3 or 4 other main points that I think Lucretia will bring out, or maybe will be preempted by Greg and Lauren.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Steve. Lauren, I'm going to bring you up on stage now. Lauren, of course, representing the one of the 2 panels for the Burkean point of view. What say you?
Well, I'm actually thrilled because I think Stephen and I are going to disagree about almost everything. So,
good.
It's absolutely true that Burke disparages theory and metaphysics in a very specific kind of way, right? He disparages the application of those directly to human social and political life without appropriate filters, without filters that keep those metaphysical principles from doing what they did in the French Revolution, which is they were the phrase that he uses, right, is that they want everything. If you don't have the filters of civic attachment, right, the attachment that we have to our little platoons, the natural rights theories become simply weapons to be weaponized by anybody who wants power. So that's one of his major criticisms. I'll also say that a lot of his natural rights sort of like thinking, a lot of his most his largest concerns with natural rights thinking come out in the Reflections on the Revolution in France, and of course he's responding to a very specific moment in time. And when you look at his work as a whole, he's very clear that rights exist. He's very clear that reason exists and is critical to human life. He's very clear that metaphysics exists and that it's critical to our understanding of justice and our understanding of the good. Where Burke splits from Locke and Hobbes is this idea that a sort of individualistic and abstract understanding of reason can help us understand what to do in any specific political or social situation when we need to understand the social and historical context in which we find ourselves. I'll respond to Stephen's point about Wilson later, because I think that one's actually one of the easier things to defend Burke about. But I think, I'll just sort of summarize a couple things that I want to say very broadly, right? I think, for Burke, it's the need is, and this I think is something that gives Burke a very holistic understanding of human nature. We need to combine reason with prejudice and emotion. The two are deeply interdependent. And if we have reason without emotion, we actually do deeply harmful things to the people that we care about, to the constitutions that we care about, and to our own country. So affection counters self-interest in a deeply important way. It counters rationality in a really important way. And then part of his critique of Locke is the way in which habit functions as a kind of counter to mere consent. And so the way that we filter our connections and our affections and sort of the way that we filter natural rights through our affections and our habits to our specific time and place is what makes us grounded in a kind of affection and patriotism that is consistent with human safety, human stability, and human security. So I can say a lot more on that, but I will leave that for now.
I appreciate everyone keeping this tight and brief. Let's bring Lucretia onto this stage here. Lucretia, of course, representing the Straussian side to play the, as Steve had warned me, might play the bad cop to his good cop of the debate. So feel free to have at it.
Yeah, and Steve will get a little of it too, so he won't feel left out. First of all, I read Strauss long before I read Burke. I've always disagreed with Steve that he was worth reading. I find him boring. I find him pedantic. I prefer never to read Burke if I don't have to. Let me begin there. Some people find him interesting. It's beyond me. I only read him because I read about him in Strauss. But I think my number one complaint about Burke, and this may get to the heart of the matter, is that he completely misunderstands and then misuses the very important concept of prudence. He says that prudence needs to be those traditional, historical, all of those things that allow you to learn about what happened in the past and then decide based upon the differing circumstances all around you what the best thing is to do. But you do that without any reference whatsoever to theory, to what is the best regime, and so on. And that is, of course, not what prudence is. Prudence is, of course, understanding the unchanging ground of changing rights, changing natural right, changing circumstances. And if you don't know what the unchanging ground is, then of course what you're doing is just ad hoc at any moment, which is what I think explains Burke's, if you can call it a theory at all, is ad hoc. His every comment he ever makes about anything has to do with how he's responding to the political issues of the day. If you talk about how he supposedly had more sympathy for the American Revolution than he did the French Revolution, it's because he misunderstands the American Revolution, but in a more concrete sense, it's because he believed that what was happening to the colonists in America was not virtual representation as he defined it, because they weren't being represented at all. Parliament was too far away and so on. And so he was not in favor of the natural rights revolution that happened in the United States, and probably did not see it as all that different from what happened in the French Revolution. I think that is probably Burke's number one failing, is that he thinks that there is somehow, he thinks like Jefferson, that somehow the French Revolution is equivalent to the American Revolution, when it is profoundly not. And I'll leave it at that, and we'll pick it up.
Interesting. Lots to chew on there. Greg Collins, last and certainly not least of the group here to defend the Burke position. What say you, sir?
Great, thank you. Can you hear my washing machine in the background?
It's actually, it's great.
Oh, fantastic. It's blasting my ear. If I had any prudential instincts, I would just throw that washing machine out the door. Yeah, lots of things to discuss. I guess I'll start with the most recent comments. Prudence. This characterization of Burke's prudence as a sort of immoral, amoral, pragmatic, reptilian, absence of principles is beyond me, and it's such a mischaracterization of Burke's thought and statesmanship. First, sniff test. Look at his life. If you really thought prudence was divorced from any moral principles, it would not explain his consistent efforts to affirm a moral principle and resist the tides of history, aka historicism, even if he was the political minority or social minority in every single case. And there are a litany of cases I'm happy to discuss throughout. Second, his conception of prudence, it in fact was morally charged. Prudence for him sometimes required restraint. Prudence for him sometimes required proactive action. Next question, back to maybe the heart of the matter. What were Burke's principles? He denies abstraction. He denies metaphysics. What were his principles? He defends tradition. First, he never used the word tradition in the Reflections on the Revolution in France. He used the word inheritance. He uses the word traditionary, but inheritance is the loaded term. Now, for the Straussians who are critical of Burke, you can't be critical of Burke and then also seek to recover the inherited traditions of the American founding. You can't have one and the other. Second, you can't defend classical political philosophy not only based on the conceptions of abstract metaphysics, but also on the grounds of prudence, as Strauss was keen to emphasize, prudence. You can't defend that and also criticize Burke for his prudence, because his prudence married principle with circumstance, which protects himself against a charge that his prudence was unhinged from any deeply morally loaded code. So, in a nutshell, what were his moral framework? One, he was a firm theist. He defended Anglican Christianity. So, within that, it was God, 10 Commandments, Sermon on the Mount, and everything in between. Two, natural law. He denounced geographical morality in his impeachment speeches against Warren Hastings. That he specifically used that phrase, geographical morality, to demonstrate that a firm moral principle in one circumstance did not apply to another circumstance. Now, there are questions about the extent that he was a Thomist, a doctrinaire, natural law thinker. But he used this language, and two, again, based on his words and deeds, it's very difficult to remove those moral principles from his actions, such as in the case in terms of Warren Hastings' impeachment, in which he ended up being alienated from the Whig Party throughout that long impeachment process, which took over 10 to the last 12 years of his life. Other moral principles. One, crucially, his conception of inherited manners and morals. This was the collection of a European inheritance that was grounded both in Christian morality and what he called the spirit of religion and the spirit of a gentleman. So combining religion with the unwritten code of manners, chivalry, gallantry that demonstrate respect towards women, towards the poor, towards the sick, towards the powerless. That is a firm moral principle that was embedded in Burke's moral code that also informed his conception of prudence. I'll stop there and happy to tease this out throughout.
Do I get first right?
There's plenty here on the table. I don't mind you hopping in there, Lucretia. I will first kind of add, again, for the listeners who have a thoughtful comment or question, I will certainly entertain those. Emphasis on the thoughtful part to that. I think there's plenty here on the table. I think that it sounds like there's plenty of people that are chomping at the bits. I'm going to wed something together just as a thought to throw out there, and then Lucretia, if you want to respond in kind, you can. But Lauren, I think you and I both picked up on when Steve Hayward mentioned Woodrow Wilson. That is somebody that I remember when I first learned that Wilson was such a big fan of Burke. It felt like that day when I was a much younger man and learned that Marilyn Manson was endorsing George W. Bush over Al Gore. And I'm like, what? I don't. My world was kind of exploding. But I do want to wed that into kind of this notion, as Lucretia mentions, that prudence is something Burke gets wrong. I mean, this is a recurring theme, I think, for the last couple hundred years, and those who Wilson was a fan of Burke, and a lot of people like Peter Stanlis and Father Canavan and Russell Kirk spent a lot of time saying, hey, you guys are getting Burke wrong. He's not utilitarian. He has these deeper principles. And so I guess I'm often curious on this one central point is, what is it we're arguing about? Is it that Leo Strauss misunderstood Burke, or is it that he understood Burke and Burke was still wrong? And you don't have to respond to that directly, because I'm sure you all have your own questions. But Lucretia, if you want to go ahead, since you asked for first dibs here.
I can answer the last question by giving my my rebuttal, and because the way Greg characterized what I said is not what I said. I never said moral principles. I never said that, because I do believe that Burke's prudence had moral principles as he defined them. But those moral principles do not and should not, cannot have their basis in some theoretical notion of what is the best regime. It was always a moral principle relevant to in most cases, of course, the ideal, the British Constitution. It was the aristocratic inheritance and all of those wonderful things that came out of that. And I agree, Christianity, but not necessarily because those things would teach us in a political sense what the best regime is. I have this argument with our other co-host all of the time. He wants to say that prudence is just utilitarianism, and I don't think that's what Burke means. But he also doesn't mean what Jefferson meant in the Declaration of Independence. He doesn't, for certainly not that. He doesn't mean what Strauss means by prudence, which is gauging every action as a statesman by an understanding of what is the best thing possible. And that understanding must come not from moral principles, but from some transcendent notion of truth. And those are two different things. Okay, I'll leave Wilson to the others, because I'm sort of with you on this. I don't think just because I don't think we need to blame Burke because Wilson happened to pick up on certain aspects of his rather convoluted thought. I don't think that's Burke's fault. He has other things to criticize.
And Greg, I'll let you respond to that, since Lucretia was speaking mostly with you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Lucretia. We never met before. Just briefly on Wilson, yeah, no, absolutely right. I mean, Burke, someone said his arguments could be used for and against every single proposition out there, which actually could fuel a Straussian criticism of Burke's seeming historicism. But as a brief counterexample, how come the abolitionists were actually quoting Burke in their campaign against slavery and throughout the 19th century in America? How come Burke was probably the first prominent English statesman to draft a comprehensive, systematic plan for the gradual abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire? And that actually captures, is a quintessence of his concept of prudence. The moral principle was emancipation, liberation for slaves, and not only that, but actually the facilitation of slaves into a social order to promote their religiosity, prosperity, families, and so on. But his proposal was a gradual emancipatory scheme in which gradually slaves received more and more rights up to the point in which they could purchase their freedom, or the slave owner could release them. In that case, it was marriage of principle and prudence, insofar as the actualization of a principle should be pursued as far as to preserve the existing social circumstances. One. Two, in terms of the best regime, actually Burke did have a conception of the best regime. You have to, admittedly, this is difficult with Burke and a weakness of Burke. He, in some ways, for political theorists like myself, because he's not the systematic treatise writer. He's not writing the two treatises, or the Leviathan, or the Second Discourse. He's not even writing dialogues, the Platos of the world. He's not writing the ethics. And so it does take a little legwork to actually bring out what he the substance of his ideas. But I'll give you another answer. All this debate, all the scholarship, hot air on this question of what's Burke's best regime, I'll tell you right now. Everyone listening, here's his best regime. One, a community that is religiously, morally inspired, spiritually fulfilled. Why do I say this? One, he applies this both to Christian Europe. He also applies this to Indians, not a Christian people, but when he was defending Indian customs, which include the religious customs, for him, it's absolutely imperative to create some sort of human flourishing in a culture that was different from European civilization. We have religious fulfillment, spiritual fulfillment, moral fulfillment. The idea that there's an inherited moral code that all generations should abide by, up to the point in which perhaps at some point a ritual outlasts its purpose, and then that code can be gradually reformed or eradicated. But inherited moral code. Third, property rights. Property rights were both indispensable to breed a leadership class, stewardship, the common good, judgment, wisdom, moderation, all those qualities that were necessary for a leader, which we can date back to Aristotle's conception of citizenship as someone who is freed from the demands of labor. And so I can go on and on. So for his conception of the best regime, it was a careful blend of these various approaches that was in which he tried to strike a harmonious balance between religion, morals, economic activity. And by the way, when Strauss lambastes Burke for, God forbid, defending the idea that the pursuit of commercial prosperity itself is a precursor of historicism. Well, guess what? Anyone with common sense, unless you want to live like a monk, which is absolutely fine, but anyone with common sense would certainly defend the idea that the pursuit of enlightened self-interest does generate commercial prosperity. And not only that, in the last part of Burke's chapter, he doesn't, in Strauss's chapter on Burke, he doesn't take the next step. For Burke, Strauss fails to mention this. Commercial prosperity itself, back to the question of the best regime, was not sufficient. Commerce should be subordinate to religion, to morals, and manners. And if you reverse that, if commerce, what he calls the sophisters, economists, and calculators, if they start to lead society, that would generate social destruction and strip away the moral and religious glow of that any civilization should embrace throughout time. Thank you.
Josh, can I jump in right on that point with Greg? So first of all, I think one of the things that Strauss is doing, although it never does it directly, is that Burke is very inconsistent. So you rightly mentioned in your first remarks that Burke sounded like an absolutist on natural rights on the India question, right? The impeachment of Warren Hastings, which, by the way, Democrats are going to make the impeachment of Trump as long as the impeachment of Hastings, I think, is the object of things, right? So one quick quote from Burke and then one from Strauss. So his 1783 speech on Fox's India bill, Burke opens up as follows. The rights of men, that is to say, the natural rights of mankind, are indeed sacred things. And if any public measure is proved mischievous to affect them, the objection ought to be fatal to that measure, even if no charter at all could be set up against it. Which we don't even need the text. We could sort of use natural reasoning, right? That sounds like something Jefferson would say, right? And I think there's a lot of inconsistencies in Burke. And so another one, he doesn't like the Declaration of Independence, though he never wrote it down, right? Here's one of his letters. This is a very short sentence. And there's two or three like this that I've got in my notes. Here's a letter from 1789, actually, after the revolution has started, after the Bastille is stormed. He says, a positively vicious and abusive government ought to be changed, and if necessary, by violence, if it cannot be, as sometimes it is the case, reformed. And elsewhere he says, I don't want to defend the current French regime from any reform. It's clearly a bad regime, right? I forget where I have all the quotes. So the argument is he's inconsistent about things. And I think, by the way, Strauss's own chapter can be accused of inconsistency. That's the case Steve Lenzner made in his famous article, The Three Burkes in Strauss, right? It's very complicated because Lenzner's a complicated guy. But I do notice something in beginning of Strauss's chapter that I think is quite unique to his discussion of Burke. He mentions, as and you did, that Burke never wrote a theoretical treatise. But then it's on page 296 if you want to look it up. He says, again, I'll read this, it's very short. The practical character of Burke's thought partly explains why he did not hesitate to use the language of modern natural right whenever that could assist him in persuading his modern audience of the soundness of a policy which he recommended. That's a very unusual thing for Strauss to write. He normally always just took the substance of what the author he had in mind said and never really referred to context, never imputed any kind of what you might say a political motive in the sort of low way we understand political. That's a very unusual thing. And I think, by the way, that's really if you really know Strauss's work, that's a pretty damning thing to say in a lot of ways, right? And so it gets us back to this question, which we can say more about later if we have time, of why he wrote this chapter and never wrote about Burke ever again, really. I mean, a couple of places he gets a very brief mention. And I think you could say, for listeners who know the Strauss corpus, the argument of this book is extended later with The Three Waves of Modernity, long essay, and also a longer version of that is in the famous lecture, What is Political Philosophy, where Burke makes no appearance, but extends this argument a much longer story arc. And then finally, I'll just plant this pin here. To make sense of Burke's prudence, you do have to connect his very short discussion of Aquinas early in the book with what he's saying about Burke here. That's very confused and tangled, because on the one hand, Strauss starts off by saying, yeah, Burke's trying to take us back to the classics, and by the end of the essay, he's not. And figuring that all out is you really got to follow the bouncing ball, and it's very hard.
Lauren, of course, I want to give you an opportunity to speak, and as a reminder, we've not yet completely cleared up the low-hanging fruit of Woodrow Wilson, if you want to give that a try also.
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everybody else, and I think just the fact that Wilson liked someone is not enough to condemn them. I think the things that Wilson liked was the fact that Burke is in many respects an incrementalist, right? He's opposed to dramatic social change, which is what Wilson himself was, and then Wilson was also he was very taken with Burke's reputation as an orator, right? He was thinking about Burke as a statesman. And the fact that Burke was famous as a statesman for his rhetoric. And so, I actually don't think that Wilson, insofar as Wilson himself doesn't have a lot of firm, stable principles, he certainly would not find those in Burke because he wouldn't be looking for them. But to approach Stephen's question about the sort of the inconsistencies that we find in Burke, I mean, that's one area that I think you have to read Burke without a lot of good faith to find these. And I think a lot of this does come back to the fact that Burke is a statesman. And so when we look at what Burke says over and over again about natural rights, over and over again about reason, right? Over and over again about metaphysical truth, he never denies it. And to get to Greg's point really quickly, the idea that there is no such thing as sort of an ideal regime, right? Burke is very clear. He says, in order to love your country, it should be lovely. And that implies that there is a stable kind of some kind of principle that we are holding up as the definition of lovely, right? It is good. It is true. It is beautiful. And so Burke, I think, has that, right? When he criticizes the East India Company, when he criticizes the treatment of the Irish, when he criticizes the treatment of slaves, when he criticizes even, the treatment of the Americans, right? He has a standard that he's appealing to. And it's not simply like, the British have done this for eons, because in many cases, the British have done terrible things for eons, right? Somehow Burke is able to distinguish between the actions of the British Empire that he sees as virtuous, as in line with enduring principles of right, and those that are not. I'll just give two quick quotes, and then I would love to hear what other folks say. He has a couple that I think are really critical, right? He says here, far am I from denying in theory, full as my heart is from withholding in practice the real rights of men. In denying their false claims of right, I do not mean to injure those which are real, and as such are such as their pretended rights would totally destroy. And then the other one that I just want to bring up, the pretended rights of these theorists are all extremes, and in proportion as they are metaphysically true, they are morally and politically false. The rights of men are in a sort of middle, incapable of definition, but not impossible to be discerned. So what many people see as inconsistencies in Burke's thinking is the way that he's applying enduring principles of right across contexts, across historical contexts, across social contexts, right, across various kinds of different spaces where they need to be filtered through affections, and they need to be filtered through custom and norms and these other kinds of values. But to say that he doesn't have an enduring principle, when to Greg's point, right, he was willing to sacrifice most of his life, right? I mean, he died penniless in large part because he devoted so much of his life to saving French refugees. I mean, so the idea that he sort of is just, willy-nilly sort of like choosing ideas as they sort of seem fit to him is not how he lives his life. It's not how he applied his values to the various kinds of injustice that he saw in the world. And I think we see a deep consistency in Burke's thought over the course of his life. And he never denies natural rights, right? He could, like, if we wanted to find examples of true inconsistency in Burke, we could look for spaces where he says, natural rights don't actually exist. They're dangerous, right? They're wrong. He never says that. In fact, every time he says anything about natural rights, he says they exist. They absolutely exist. But as statesmen, we have to be very careful how we apply them to specific kinds of policy problems, because they're deeply dangerous when they're misapplied. And so it's the misapplication of reason, the misapplication of metaphysics that's so dangerous in Burke's view.
Lucretia, if I'm reading your face correctly, you're not convinced.
No, I'm
she has an
convinced
easy
right
to
up
read
until
face.
the end. I do.
Okay,
I'm
okay.
convinced right up to the end. The misapplication, I don't think that's correct. He actually, and this is a larger issue. If we get to the second question that I know that Josh wants to get to, I don't mean to preempt you here, but whether or not Burke has anything to add to teach Americans. Absolutely not. And I would say, for the reason that you just said, and also what Greg said earlier about property rights. Remember, Burke supposedly completely, shall we say, dissed John Locke's second treatise. And the American understanding of property rights comes directly from that. It is not Burke's understanding of property rights. Burke's understanding of property rights is that you have a landed aristocracy that creates all of that, and you could almost call it Aristotelian, creates the leisure, the educational opportunities, so that you can have this aristocracy that maybe can be trusted with governing the unwashed masses that he supposedly cares so much about. They certainly shouldn't have the vote, all those other things. So his view of the right to property is not a natural right to property per se, as we would find it in Locke, and as I believe was incorporated into our Constitution. And again, his idea of moral principles have no more basis in reality, in some kind of transcendent standard, that's a better way to put it, then he's just reaching back to, if you want to call it heredity, you want traditionalism, whatever word you want to use. And the problem with there not being that transcendent standard, when you say his best regime is this, this, and this, that is not a transcendent standard that informs us from above his example of the best regime and why it would be a just and good regime. And I would go one step further and just say that what would Burke find wrong with the current British Constitution? Anything? And we've had slow incremental changes so that Britain looks nothing like it did even a century ago. And it's an uglier, less just place. And it all happened nicely, incrementally, with lots of nice moral principles. Remember, Islam radical Islam, Sharia law, those are all nice moral principles. And that's what England has adopted incrementally and over time, just like Burke would want them to. That's how I'd sort of leave why we have nothing to learn from Burke.
I'm going to let Greg, you look like you might have a stroke if I don't let you respond to that. So
pained.
please.
He looks pained.
Of course, you would find much. I assume he may find many problems with the British Constitution today. If not, when in his time, he actually was responsible for legislation that eliminated over 100 useless offices in the royal household. So in this idea of incremental change, admittedly, his language leans in that direction, but he was also for substantive, formative change when that was necessary, proportional to the problems. This is why I mentioned in my piece on Burke and Strauss, the fact that Burke, in the sense, was trying to cut, the lard off the administrative executive state in Britain at that time is roughly synonymous. You could draw a connection between that and the Straussian attempt to reduce the size and scope of the administrative state today. But a couple more things. Locke, property rights. I fundamentally disagree. One, Locke had limited, if any, influence on the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. By that point, Locke's natural rights arguments had subsided. Blackstone, Montesquieu rose in prominence. And guess what? Blackstone and Montesquieu, they were not referring to, they were the common law tradition, similar to the Blackstone, the same Blackstone that Burke references in the Reflection on the Revolution in France, along with John Selden, Edward Coke, Magna Carta, Declaration of Right, Petition of Right, and so on. Property rights stands back to those inherited norms, God forbid, of the Magna Carta. Even before that, the Magna Carta preserved those pre-existing rights, due process rights, Article 39, Article 40, the right of corporations, and so on. And the fact that the insinuation that there's no coherent understanding of property rights before the anonymous publication of John Locke's second treatise, it just doesn't make sense. That's
what I said. But...
Not to mention that Locke's influence receded throughout the 18th century. He was read by the Jeffersons of the world, but most people had not read the second two treatises of government. If anything, more people had read his essay concerning human understanding. And Burke was actually a little more sympathetic to that than the two treatises of government. Which, Steve, to your point, actually, I looked up that quote as well. Secondhand, Burke did say that the two treatises may have been the worst book ever written. A couple more points. One, natural rights. The cat's out of the bag. So, Lucretia, let me ask you. Are your natural rights being violated right now? Because mine sure are. I'm married. I have 3 children. I'm in a suit. If I really want to serve my natural rights, I could divorce my wife, discard my children like Rousseau did, the avatar of natural rights, by the way, as we all know. Why would I need to wear clothes during this call if I have the natural right not to wear clothes? You know why? Because it's Burke's defense of the moral imagination that in our particular situation, social roles in life, there are particular roles, responsibilities, and obligations that accompany those particular roles. So in this case, we're professionals. We're debating this question of Burke and Strauss, and so therefore we should dress properly. Same with in my engagement with my wife and my children, there are particular roles and responsibilities that I have to fulfill to be a good husband and to be a good father. When people say Burke has no moral principles, it's actually a far more profound conception of morality than stunted conceptions of natural rights. It's multidimensional and multi-layered. As a husband, I have particular responsibilities. As a teacher, I have different responsibilities. As a participant in this debate, I have different responsibilities. Now, if you want to really push natural rights to its metaphysical conclusion, then that would render the logical justification to discard my wife. As we know, Locke suggested divorce was permissible based on natural rights, the fact that in marriage were 2 individual wills. As I just mentioned, Rousseau, as we know, discarded his 5 children. As we know, the French Revolution, they destroyed any of these immemorial customs that otherwise bound families, localities, jurisdictions, communities together. So natural rights doctrine, critiquing Burke for not fully fleshing out a conception of natural rights doctrine. And I will actually agree that he used natural rights here and there. From my reading, he actually invokes natural rights more in the context of non-English people. So in the case of France, African slaves in the Caribbean, India, and so on. But if you really want to push the natural rights logic to its final conclusion, then take the next step and say that we should dissolve any of these institutions, attachments that inhibit our natural rights.
I do want to give Lucretia a chance to respond. I know Steve and Lauren need to have a chance to talk too. He's had a concern that Greg was about to strip.
Well,
so I appreciate you
landing.
I appreciate you taking the Burkean view there, Greg. But I will return to Lauren and Stephen just in a moment. But Lucretia, since he had mentioned you specifically, do you want to respond to that briefly? Yeah,
absolutely. First of all, if you cannot see the difference between Lockean natural rights and Rousseauian natural rights, there's no reason in carrying on this conversation, because Locke makes it very clear what it is a social contract needs to do. Furthermore, our founding is definitely not based on any kind of Rousseauian concept of natural rights. We don't go back in the state of nature to the natural man who lies there naked by the stream and drinks here and eats here and all those other silly things. Rousseau's unimportant in my opinion. It's unfortunate that he ever came upon the world, but that's a whole different discussion. Not for Strauss, because remember, the critique of modern natural right chapter in Natural Right and History is about two people. It's about Rousseau and it's about Burke, and both of them are equally and in many ways similarly wrong. Okay, so that being said, the natural right to property, which is articulated in the second treatise of Locke, is in fact exactly what Madison says needs to be protected in Federalist Number 10. Okay, there's no doubt whatsoever that Locke's understanding of the right to property, of social contract theory, and so on, is directly influenced in our notion of creating a government based upon consent. And those natural rights that the Declaration talks about are not the natural rights that Burke does sometimes give lip service to, nor does he think that they should have any influence on how we might make the revolutionary change to our system of government that happened in the Declaration of Independence. It's why he never could say anything good about it. He might have thought that the colonists had a decent complaint because they weren't being properly represented in Parliament, but that's not what the biggest complaint about their situation with Great Britain was. That was all that Burke had to say about it. The idea that Locke is not the intellectual forebear of the right to property as protected in both the Declaration and the Constitution to me is absolutely crazy. It's not all these other things. Go ahead.
I'll have you a chance. Yes, I'll let you cut in. I'm just going to call an audible right quick. We probably will not get a chance to adequately cover the subject of does Burke belong in the great pantheon of American conservatism? What does he have to offer? I want to give Steve, you and Lauren a chance to respond, but then we'll try to have closing comments after that.
I want to ask a quick question of Greg, just for clarification, and then Lauren, if you want to answer it, you can too. Did I hear you right, Greg, when you said Locke had little to do with the Declaration of Independence? And if I did hear you right, you think that Gary Wills was right and Carl Becker and Douglas Adair, among others, are wrong?
No, of course he had something to do with the Declaration of Independence, given that he was one of three favorite philosophers. I said the U.S. Constitution.
Oh, I thought you said the Declaration. I thought I heard you say Declaration.
In the 1780s, look at Donald Lutz's work.
Okay. Well, we don't have an argument about that. Okay. But okay. Well, all right. Well, now we can move on to the American question. By the way, Lauren, do you want to weigh in on that or not? Since I may have slurred Greg there by confusing documents.
No. Okay. You go ahead, and then I have something to add to the conservative question.
Okay. So let's jump ahead to Lincoln for a moment, right? Remember what he said a lot about the Declaration, but he said, all honor to Jefferson for announcing an abstract truth applicable to all men in all times. And I'm sure he understood that the actual language of the Declaration says, but those natural rights are vindicated in separate nations. That's the first paragraph of the Declaration. But the point is, Burke would have hated that language, right? Abstract truth applicable to all men at all times. Just as, by the way, secular, nihilist liberals today hate that language. When the Republican Party starts up in the 1840s, 1850s, and they announce that they're going to execute constitutional powers in the spirit of the Declaration. So remember that this was a big fault line between North and South, right? But I in particular land on, actually, it's this really good book about Burke in America by Drew Maytag, I guess you say his name. I don't know if you know the book, Greg or Lauren, but he goes on for several pages. It's called Edmund Burke in America. And he goes on for several pages about Rufus Choate saying, this is wrong. Declaration has nothing to do with the Constitution. And I'm going to cite Edmund Burke as my authority for the matter. There's sort of one example of why Burke is ill-fitting to American conservatism. Although, again, that, as I say, that is a live argument being revived in new forms today.
Go ahead, Lauren.
Well, I'll jump. Yeah, I think, this is one of those areas where I think the modern conservative movement could do very, very well to take some deep lessons from Burke. His conception of the intergenerational compact, I think, is deeply important to understand some of the ways that I think modern conservatism is failing itself. When he describes the intergenerational compact, right, as a compact between those who came before, those who are still living, and those who will come ahead, part of that was the duty to preserve and conserve the principles and values of the past and pass them forward to future generations. And what he was responding to was the destruction of institutions by the French, right? The sort of presentism that we see in modern liberalism, modern progressivism. And so part of what he's critical of, right, is the fact that institutions grow very slowly over time, and they need to mature over time. And so if we, and this is, by the way, that critical debate between Madison and Jefferson, right? Jefferson's understanding of a generation, right? Every 19 years, we should be feeding the tree of liberty, right? With the blood of revolutionaries. Madison was like, yeah, Jefferson, like, give it a rest, right? You can't do that to institutions, because institutions need a degree of stability in order to do their job. And so this is one of the things that I think the modern conservative movement, I think right now it's become deeply presentist. It's following in the worst of progressivism. It has rejected its conservative traditions, and it will not be able to pass those on to future generations. And so, Josh, you and I think, talked about this on our podcast, the ones that we recorded together. I have deep concerns about the harm that's being done to the conservative movement, but also to conservative institutions like rule of law, separation of powers, right? And when you look at the Constitution itself, right, and this goes back to Greg's point, right, the Constitution itself was actually pulling from the best of the British institutions that had existed before, right? We basically took the British Constitution and said, let's add, Republican democracy on top of this. And so we didn't say we're going to create something entirely new. We said, let's learn from the past. Let's read a lot of Montesquieu, to go back to Greg's point, right? Montesquieu was the most cited political theorist in the Federalist Papers. And Montesquieu was looking at the institutions that the British Constitution had grown over time. So I would say that modern conservatism deeply needs Burke, and deeply needs an understanding of an intergenerational compact that can help push it away from the presentism that I think is going to destroy it.
We are very low on time, and I want to make sure each of you have a chance to get your final thoughts in. I'm sure we could easily go for another hour. I'm just gonna call an audible here and do it in this order. I'm gonna have Lucretia go first, then Greg, then Lauren, and then Stephen, because I know some of you need to hop potentially if we go too much further on. So if you got to jump off, I understand. But Lucretia, if you wouldn't mind giving your closing statements for us.
So my closing statement for why Burke is not necessary, salutary for understanding our situation in America. I'm not just responding to Lauren, because Lauren's points were very good as far as they go. What we did, in fact, inherit from the British Constitution, we did sort of a separation of powers. What we did not inherit from the British Constitution is the idea of inheritance, the idea of aristocracy, the idea of a royal king. And why? Because what our founding fathers took from the British Constitution were some institutions that seemed to be working pretty well. But if you recall, at the Constitutional Convention, the biggest debates were over two things, other than slavery, leave that aside. One, what should the character of the executive be? What should the terms, the whole thing? And two, how do we introduce into our legislative branch the kind of contrast, shall we say, that Parliament has with the landed aristocracy and the commoners, because we do not believe in a landed aristocracy. We do not believe in any kind of aristocracy. We believe, other than a natural aristocracy, which is the opposite of Burke's, we don't have time for that, but it's a Republican answer to what they learned, sure enough, from the British Constitution, but they could have just adopted that. They could have just adopted the British Constitution. They could have done it maybe the way Canada did. They didn't, because they believed in transcendent ideals, transcendent self-evident truths that, unlike Burke, they believed had to inform their revolution and then their making of a new constitution, which is anti-Burkean. And if the problem with many conservatives today is that they reject the declarations informing of the Constitution, the idea that it's just a better British Constitution. It is not. It is, in fact, a revolution in constitutions, because it is, as Hamilton, last word Hamilton said, we're going to decide for all time the important question whether societies of men can really form their political constitutions based upon reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their constitutions upon accident, Burkean accident, and force. And so I think that's why Burke has nothing to teach us. Why read Burke when you could read Lincoln instead? That's my final word.
Thank you, Lucretia. Greg, what say you?
Just briefly, I recommend a book by Greg Wiener, who wrote a book on Burke and Lincoln, comparing and contrasting their thought. Just briefly. One, the fact that the Americans didn't explicitly adopt the British Constitution actually confirms Burke's point that it's difficult to translate the particular political arrangements of one society to another society. In fact, the American founding actually captured Burke's conception of prudence. You learn from the past, the inheritance of the British Constitution, and you modify, alter, sometimes eliminate the particular appendages, institutions that do not conform to the particular sentiments, prejudices of the people. So in that sense, I think it's far more Burkean than Lucretia, as you were suggesting. Now, if going back to your earlier point, if the charge is that Burke did not believe in the idea of a founding embodied, exemplified by a constitution written by one or two single legislatures with the conception of the good life, absolutely. I think that's accurate portrayal of Burke's thought. But I highly doubt, Lucretia and Steve, that you would actually support that as well, because in the American founding, that certainly didn't happen. It was not James Madison and Thomas Jefferson writing their treatises, only de novo, stripped away from any of the norms and lessons and wisdom that they learned from their British past. And so the conception of the American founding as a de novo revolutionary abrupt departure from their past, I think, is ahistorical, A. B, it corrupts a proper understanding of the political principles and moral principles, institutional principles underlying the American founding and the Declaration of Independence in the U.S. Constitution. And we are reminded of Jefferson in his capturing of the Declaration of Independence as the harmonizing sentiments, correctly, right? Locke, Aristotle, Cicero. Who's the fourth one? Someone help me with the fourth one. But in any event, he was citing non-American thinkers who lived prior to the American founding as representing, as illustrating the principles that for him were embedded in the Declaration of Independence. And then also just yes, we eliminate titles of nobility, but do we eliminate inherited property rights? Of course not, because we always have this debate over the inheritance tax. That is a classic example of applying Burke's notion of the landed aristocracy to a country without any titles of nobility. And yet there is, as you said, a natural aristocracy. And this debate over property inheritance does underscore this point about the importance of property rights from generation to generation, as part of Lauren's description of intergenerational.
The limited entail.
Yes,
right.
And if they explicitly adopted those customs, then that would have actually not reflected Burke's belief that some particulars in society should not be translated, nor should be not translatable, nor should be translated to other societies. Back to the point about natural rights. If natural rights are universal, transcendent, and metaphysical, then let's advocate right now for the natural right for Muslim women to be coerced into not wearing the hijab, non-Western societies to be coerced into asserting their natural rights and upending any institutions or rituals or customs that inhibit other natural rights. If you think that that is a proper way to govern society, one's own society or other societies, that just simply leads to coercion and the trepidations that Burke held about the French Revolution. I'll end there.
And I know I'm getting this a little out of order here, but I want to let Lauren go because I realize some people need to leave. If you need to leave in the conversation, that's totally fine. But Lauren, let me give you a chance for closing thoughts, and then we'll turn to Steve to wrap us up here.
Yeah, I'll just end really quickly by pointing out that Burke doesn't defend aristocracy as a good in and of itself. He defends aristocracy as something that exists in the British regime, that has been useful in the British regime, and that would be deeply difficult to root out without violence. And that's his argument for in like minimal defense of the aristocracy in France, right? He admits that they were abusive, but he says that what's happening in France is harmful, not because the aristocracy is good qua good, right? It's a deeply embedded social institution that will require an enormous amount of violence to undo. And by the way, I'll just add, Tocqueville argues that our replacement for the aristocracy was lawyers, right? We actually did this thing of taking the sort of British institutions and democratizing them, right? We wanted the same kinds of institutions that served the same functions in society, and so we figured out ways to pull them into our political system. But to Greg's point, I just want to say again, there was actually an enormous amount that was Burkean at the American Revolution, right? I mean, if you look at the treatment of colonial law and common law, the treatment of contracts before and after the Declaration, right? We did not uproot our world the way that the French did. And so the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, the American Revolution is much more a Burkean revolution than it is a Lockean revolution.
All right, Steve, let's let you close us out.
Okay. So I resist the way Greg puts, I think, a straw man of, natural rights means, how did you put it, coercing women to, the sort of modern examples you gave. I think remember that Strauss's purpose, and it is convoluted in this chapter, of the whole book, is to restore an openness to classical natural right, which is very different, based on teleology. We haven't brought that up at all. That's an extremely important point. And I think Burke is kind of allergic to that a bit. And of course, Strauss, elsewhere in other writings, says it's not clear we can recover that. That's another story for another day. But I do think I'd say two or three things about it. One is there's a famous line of Burke's where he says in the Reflections that a polity that was without the means of change is without the means of its own self-preservation. So he's not a reactionary. That's an important point. But his framework for this is, we've already mentioned, prescription. What's this line about the origins of the British Constitution are from time out of mind? Now, that's a phrase that was always used about the common law from the times of Sir Edward Coke, for example, right? But of course, the common law does rest upon not judge-made law, judge-discovered law, something I talk to students about a lot. We've lost sight of that there's a logic and reason to the law that we can figure out, right? And I think Burke's use of that same phrase is a little misleading because I think it's different. Then finally, I'll say this to Lauren about Woodrow Wilson. So it's quite true that it's possible to misread Burke, and certainly Wilson does that, right? But that actually, I think, underlines my point, which is Burke, it is not evident to even as intelligent a man as Woodrow Wilson that it was no bar to the kind of Hegelian historicism that allowed Wilson to substitute vision. Remember, that was his big thing. The modern progressive leader needs to be a man or leader of vision and leadership, and that takes the place of prudence. Wilson had very little to say about the idea of prudence. He liked the prescription part of Burke. He completely ignores the prudence part of Burke, which is itself got its all tangles and all the rest of that. But that's why I still say that Wilson's embrace of Burke shows the defects of Burke.
And
by the way, Josh, we could go another 3 hours here, so we may have to do a sequence.
Oh yes. No, it's only
the
and we haven't even.
What do you think of the Oxford?
Yeah, we haven't brought up the Oxford comma yet. Yeah,
I got to go teach a class on the progressives, so I'm going to say goodbye to everybody.
So good to have you, Lucretia. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. It was a lot of fun, guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I enjoed it immensely.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Greg is wrong about the Oxford comma too. The Oxford comma is a part of classical natural right. It's there in Aristotle.
That's right.
I wished we hadn't.
Yeah, go ahead.
You have to leave as well?
No, go ahead, Josh. If you're wrapping up,
I was just going to say, I wished you hadn't left your last word on Wilson. I'm. Well, I'll say the moderator's prerogative. I'll just point out that didn't Wilson have a lot of nice things to say about Abraham Lincoln too?
Oh, but he totally misunderstands Lincoln. I mean, he strips.
I know, but he totally misunderstands Burke.
Right. Yeah. No, that was the we could do a whole episode, the four of us on Wilson if we want. I think Lauren may be too sympathetic to him. I don't know. No, your mic's off, Lauren. We're not hearing you, so I don't know. Anyway, okay.
All right. Well, guys, thank you for everyone watching. There's a comment here. Where can we find everyone's socials and/or other writings? I'm going to repost this on the podcast, and I will put those links in the descriptions. Also, all three of the Lucretia was not, but all three of the individuals you're seeing on the call now have been in prior Saving Elephants episodes. You can check out those prior conversations and and their contacts are on there as well. Thank you guys so much. This has been wonderful. I wish we could have gone longer, but it was good as it went. And thank you everyone for watching, and we will see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.